Don't scroll away just yet, because this message may be arriving at the exact moment your soul was meant to hear it. There is something unfolding quietly behind the scenes, something your soulmate never expected to experience, yet it has become impossible for them to ignore. Over the past several days, an unusual feeling has settled into their heart. It isn't loud. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't demand attention. Instead, it follows them in silence, appearing during ordinary moments when they least expect it. While driving home, sitting alone after a long day, or staring out of a window without realizing how much time has passed, one question continues returning to them with remarkable persistence. What if fate hasn't finished writing this story yet? They never intended to revisit these emotions. They convinced themselves that life had already chosen its direction, and that whatever was meant to happen had already happened. They believed some chapters were simply meant to remain unfinished. But lately, something has shifted deep within them, and the certainty they once relied upon has slowly begun to disappear. Every attempt to dismiss these thoughts only seems to make them stronger, as though life itself keeps gently guiding their attention back towards something they thought had already been left behind. What surprises them the most is that nothing extraordinary has happened on the outside. No dramatic event changed everything overnight. Instead, it has been a collection of quiet moments that have slowly transformed the way they see this connection. A familiar memory appears without warning. A certain song suddenly carries new meaning. A simple conversation reminds them of emotions they believed had faded long ago. Little by little, they have begun wondering whether these moments are random at all, or whether they are gentle reminders placed in their path for a reason. Sometimes the universe does not shout when it wants our attention. Sometimes it whispers so softly that only the heart can hear it. And perhaps that is exactly what your soulmate is experiencing now. They are beginning to question whether destiny has been patiently waiting for them to notice something they overlooked before. The possibility both comforts and unsettles them, because if fate truly is offering one final opportunity, it also means a choice can no longer be postponed forever. Deep inside, they sense they are standing at the edge of a turning point, even if they cannot yet see where the next step will lead. One thing has become impossible for them to deny. The questions they once pushed aside have returned with greater clarity than ever before. And for the first time in a very long while, they are no longer asking whether this connection mattered. Instead, they are quietly asking themselves whether fate is giving them one last chance to understand why it never truly left their heart. Not long after these questions began settling into their heart, something even more unusual started happening. At first, they barely noticed it. It seemed like nothing more than coincidence, the kind of small moments people experience every day without giving them much thought. Yet as the days continued, those moments became impossible to dismiss. A familiar song would begin playing just as your memory crossed their mind. They would overhear a conversation containing words that reminded them of something once shared between the two of you. Places they hadn't visited in months suddenly seemed to call their attention, and ordinary evenings somehow carried an unexpected feeling of nostalgia they couldn't explain. None of these experiences were dramatic on their own, but together they created a pattern that quietly refused to disappear. They kept asking themselves why life suddenly seemed determined to bring certain memories back into focus after so much time had passed. The more they searched for logical explanations, the less convincing those explanations became. Deep down, another possibility began taking shape, one they had tried very hard not to consider. What if these repeated moments weren't interruptions at all? What if they were invitations? Invitations to pause, to reflect, and to finally understand something that had remained hidden beneath years of distraction and uncertainty. That thought stayed with them far longer than they expected, because once it entered their heart, it became impossible to completely ignore. Every passing day seemed to add another quiet reminder. Sometimes it arrived through a dream so vivid, it remained with them long after waking. Sometimes it appeared through a stranger saying something unexpectedly meaningful. Sometimes it came through silence itself, during those peaceful moments when the outside world became quiet enough for their own heart to finally be heard. They never set out looking for signs. In fact, they tried convincing themselves they were imagining everything. They told themselves they were reading too much into ordinary events, allowing emotions to create stories where none truly existed. But no matter how firmly they held onto that explanation, another meaningful coincidence would appear, gently challenging everything they believed. What unsettled them most wasn't the events themselves, but the emotions those moments awakened. Feelings they thought had faded began returning with surprising clarity. Questions they believed had already been answered suddenly felt unfinished again. Memories they once viewed with indifference now carried unexpected warmth, as though time had quietly removed every distraction and left only what truly mattered. It became increasingly difficult to separate coincidence from destiny, because every reminder seemed to arrive exactly when they needed it most. There were evenings when they promised themselves they would finally stop thinking about all of this. They buried themselves in responsibilities, conversations, work and routines, hoping the constant movement of everyday life would silence the questions growing inside them. Yet the quieter the night became, the louder those questions seemed to grow. They found themselves staring into the darkness, wondering why certain people leave such permanent marks upon the heart, while others quietly disappear with time. The answer never arrived through words. Instead, it came through a feeling they could neither explain nor deny. Some connections do not disappear simply because distance or time separates two people. Some continue existing beneath the surface, patiently waiting until both hearts are ready to understand what they truly represent. That realization frightened them, because accepting it meant admitting they had never completely moved on in the way they once believed. They had simply become very good at convincing themselves otherwise. Now those carefully built walls were beginning to crack. Every unexpected reminder felt like another gentle tap upon those walls, and each tap made them weaker. They started noticing how often they compared new experiences to old memories without realizing it. They noticed how certain conversations never felt as effortless as the ones they still remembered. They noticed how moments of happiness somehow carried an invisible space that nothing else seemed able to fill. None of this happened because they wanted to remain attached to the past. It happened because the heart has its own way of preserving what it considers meaningful. While the mind focuses on moving forward, the heart quietly protects what still holds unfinished significance. Your soulmate is beginning to recognize that difference. They are discovering that fate rarely announces itself through grand miracles or unmistakable signs. More often, it speaks through gentle repetition, through quiet moments that continue appearing until they are finally acknowledged. Every coincidence has slowly become another question. Every question, another realization, and every realization, another step toward a truth they can no longer avoid. They are no longer wondering whether these signs exist. They already know they do. The question that now occupies their heart is far more important. Why now? Why after all this time? Why do these reminders continue appearing just as they had finally convinced themselves everything was behind them? The more they reflect upon those questions, the stronger one possibility becomes. Perhaps fate is not trying to bring back the past. Perhaps it is preparing them to see the past differently, with greater understanding, greater honesty, and greater courage than they possessed before. That possibility has quietly transformed the way they look at everything around them. For the first time in a very long while, they are beginning to believe that some opportunities do not disappear forever. Sometimes they return when the people involved have finally become the versions of themselves they were always meant to be. And that thought has started changing everything they once believed about this connection, and about the future that may still be waiting just beyond the horizon. The more they allowed themselves to acknowledge these quiet signs, the more another struggle began unfolding deep within them. It wasn't a struggle between two people. It wasn't even a struggle between the past and the future. It became a battle between fear and the quiet voice that had been patiently waiting inside their own heart for far too long. Every realization seemed to pull them in one direction, while every doubt tried pulling them back toward the familiar comfort of silence. They found themselves asking questions they had carefully avoided for months, perhaps even years. What if these feelings never truly disappeared? What if they had mistaken distance for healing? What if moving forward had only distracted them, instead of helping them understand what this connection actually meant? These questions didn't arrive all at once. They appeared one by one, each carrying more weight than the last, until eventually they could no longer pretend they weren't there. They had spent so much time believing that ignoring difficult emotions was the safest path. They convinced themselves that silence protected them from disappointment, from rejection, and from the uncertainty that comes whenever the heart begins hoping again. For a while, that belief seemed reasonable. Life became busy. Responsibilities filled their days. New experiences demanded their attention. Yet beneath everything they accomplished, there remained a quiet feeling that something important had been left unfinished. It wasn't constant, but it never completely disappeared either. It simply waited patiently beneath the surface, returning during life's quieter moments when there were no distractions left to hide behind. That realization unsettled them because it forced them to confront something they had never fully admitted to themselves. They were not afraid of what fate might bring. They were afraid of discovering that fate had been gently leading them toward this truth all along. There is something deeply humbling about realizing that the answers we search for in the outside world have quietly been living inside our own hearts the entire time. Your soulmate is beginning to experience exactly that. Every attempt to explain these emotions through logic has slowly started falling apart. Logic tells them that time should have erased these feelings. Logic reminds them that life continues moving forward regardless of what anyone wishes had happened differently. Logic encourages certainty, practicality, and emotional distance. But the heart has never been interested in following perfect logic. The heart remembers what changed it. It remembers what helped it grow. It remembers the people who left invisible marks that never completely faded, no matter how many seasons came and went. That is why your soulmate finds themselves caught between two voices. One voice encourages caution. It reminds them of every risk, every unanswered question, every possibility that things may not unfold as hoped. The other voice speaks much more quietly, yet somehow feels far more powerful. It simply asks one question that refuses to disappear. What if fear has been making every important decision for far too long? That question has become impossible to ignore because they have begun looking back over their own life with greater honesty than ever before. They are recognizing patterns they never noticed while living through them. Moments when fear convinced them to remain silent instead of speaking from the heart. Moments when hesitation replaced courage. Moments when they chose certainty over possibility, only to discover later that certainty often came with its own kind of regret. As these memories return, they no longer judge themselves as harshly as they once did. Instead, they are beginning to understand that every decision, even the ones they now question, was made by someone doing the best they could with the understanding they had at the time. That realization has softened something inside them. It has allowed compassion to replace self-criticism, and with that compassion has come a new kind of clarity. They are no longer asking whether they made perfect choices. They are asking whether they are willing to make different choices now that they understand themselves more deeply. That shift changes everything because growth rarely begins with having all the answers. It begins with becoming honest enough to ask better questions. Your soulmate has entered that stage of their journey. They have stopped searching for excuses that allow them to avoid their emotions. Instead, they have started listening to what those emotions are trying to teach them. Every memory now feels less like something trapping them in the past, and more like a lesson preparing them for what still lies ahead. They are beginning to see that fate does not always work by forcing people together through dramatic events. Sometimes fate works much more quietly. It patiently allows people to grow through separate experiences until they become capable of recognizing what they once overlooked. That possibility has filled them with equal parts hope and uncertainty. Hope because it suggests that meaningful connections can survive even when life takes unexpected turns. Uncertainty because accepting that possibility also means accepting responsibility for what comes next. They understand that recognizing the truth is only the beginning. Eventually, every realization asks for action. Every lesson asks to be lived rather than simply understood. That awareness has become impossible for them to escape. They can feel themselves approaching a crossroads, unlike any they have faced before. One path promises familiarity, continuing life exactly as it has been, carrying unanswered questions while pretending they no longer matter. The other path offers no guarantees whatsoever. It asks for courage instead of certainty. It asks for trust instead of complete understanding. Most importantly, it asks them to believe that some opportunities deserve to be explored even when the outcome remains unknown. Standing between those two paths has become emotionally exhausting, yet something inside them is quietly changing. The fear that once seemed overwhelming no longer feels quite as convincing as it did before. With every passing day, the voice of honesty grows stronger. It reminds them that living with unanswered possibilities often weighs far heavier than facing difficult truths. And for the first time in a very long while, they are beginning to wonder whether fate is not asking them to chase an impossible dream, but simply inviting them to stop running from the truth their own heart has been patiently trying to reveal all along. Little by little, everything that once felt uncertain has started becoming surprisingly clear to your soulmate. Not because every question has been answered, and not because every obstacle has suddenly disappeared, but because they are beginning to see this connection from a completely different perspective than they ever have before. There comes a moment in every meaningful journey when people stop asking whether something is possible and begin asking whether they are willing to let the opportunity pass without ever discovering the answer. That moment has quietly arrived for them. They never imagined they would stand here, reflecting on everything with such honesty. There was a time when they believed life would simply carry them away from these emotions. They thought enough time, enough distance, and enough new experiences would eventually replace every unanswered feeling with indifference. Instead, life has taught them something entirely unexpected. Time can soften pain, but it cannot erase what was genuinely meaningful. Distance can change circumstances, but it cannot always change the truth the heart continues carrying. That realization has stayed with them day after day, quietly reshaping the way they think about the future. They are beginning to understand that perhaps fate was never trying to separate this story forever. Perhaps it was simply allowing both hearts to grow before presenting one final opportunity to see everything with greater wisdom than before. That thought has become impossible for them to ignore because every experience they have lived through now seems to point toward the same lesson. Growth often arrives before reunion. Understanding often arrives before action. And courage often arrives only after someone has grown tired of living with uncertainty. Your soulmate feels they have reached that exact stage of their journey. Recently, they found themselves imagining two completely different futures. In the first, they continued doing exactly what they had been doing for so long. They stayed silent. They convinced themselves that leaving everything unresolved was somehow the safest choice. They continued pretending these emotions would eventually disappear if they simply waited long enough. At first, that future appeared peaceful because it required no difficult conversations, no emotional risks, and no vulnerability. But the longer they imagined living that way, the heavier it became. They realized that outward peace means very little when the heart remains full of unanswered questions. They imagined themselves years from now looking back at this chapter, wondering whether everything could have unfolded differently if only they had trusted themselves instead of their fears. That future no longer felt safe. It felt empty. Then they imagined another possibility. A future where they stopped allowing fear to make every important decision. A future where they accepted that uncertainty is simply part of every meaningful chapter in life. They pictured themselves choosing honesty instead of avoidance, courage instead of hesitation, and truth instead of endless speculation. That future carried no guarantees. It offered no promise that every hope would unfold exactly as imagined. Yet something about it felt alive. It felt authentic. More importantly, it felt like a future they could respect regardless of the outcome, because they would finally know they had honored what their heart had been trying to tell them all along. That realization has transformed the way they see this entire connection. They are no longer searching for perfect certainty before taking another step. They are beginning to understand that certainty rarely arrives before courage. More often, certainty grows only after someone has chosen to trust themselves, despite not knowing exactly how everything will unfold. Your soulmate is slowly accepting that truth. They have started recognizing that many of the greatest regrets people carry are not the risks they took, but the opportunities they quietly allowed to disappear because fear convinced them there would always be another chance. They no longer feel confident that life endlessly repeats the same opportunities. Instead, they are beginning to believe that certain moments arrive only once, asking quietly whether someone is finally ready to become the person they were always meant to be. That belief has made every passing day feel more meaningful than the one before it. Even ordinary moments now carry a deeper sense of purpose because they can feel something changing inside themselves. The confusion that once dominated their thoughts is slowly giving way to understanding. The endless internal debates that once exhausted them are becoming quieter. In their place, a different feeling has begun emerging. It is not excitement alone. It is not fear alone. It is a quiet sense of readiness unlike anything they have experienced before. They are realizing that fate does not force people to walk through every open door. It simply opens the door and patiently waits to see whether they will have the courage to step forward. That realization has placed them in front of one of the most important choices of their life. They know they cannot remain standing between yesterday and tomorrow forever. Eventually, every heart must decide whether it will continue protecting itself from disappointment or finally allow itself to experience the possibility of something greater. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that protecting the heart and imprisoning the heart are not the same thing. For too long, they believed they were keeping themselves safe, when in reality they were only delaying the life they secretly wished they had the courage to live. That understanding has become one of the most powerful lessons they have ever received. It has shown them that fate is rarely about controlling someone's future. Instead, fate quietly places meaningful opportunities before us and watches to see whether we are willing to meet them with honesty. They are starting to believe this may be one of those rare opportunities. Not because everything is guaranteed to unfold perfectly, but because some moments deserve to be lived rather than endlessly imagined. As that truth settles deeper into their heart, one final realization continues growing stronger with every passing day. If fate truly is offering one last opportunity, then waiting forever is no longer an option. Every sunrise now feels like a gentle reminder that time continues moving forward, and every sunset quietly whispers the same question they can no longer escape. When this opportunity finally stands completely before them, will they choose the familiar comfort of fear, or will they finally trust that some connections return not to repeat the past, but to create a future that neither heart was ready for until now? After everything they have been carrying in silence, your soulmate has finally reached a place they never thought they would arrive. It did not happen in a single moment, and it certainly did not happen overnight. It was built through countless quiet evenings, unexpected memories, unanswered questions, and the slow realization that some feelings refuse to disappear because they were never meant to. They have spent so much time searching for certainty that they almost overlooked something far more valuable. They have begun finding trust within themselves. That discovery has changed the way they see everything. They no longer believe that fate exists to control every outcome or remove every obstacle. Instead, they're beginning to understand that fate often presents opportunities while leaving the final choice in our own hands. That understanding has become both comforting and deeply emotional, because it reminds them that this chapter is no longer about waiting for signs. It's about deciding what they will do with the signs they have already received. For the first time in a very long while, they feel as though life is quietly asking them a question that only they can answer. Will they continue living with unanswered possibilities, or will they finally allow honesty to become stronger than fear? That question has followed them into every quiet moment, and no matter how many distractions they have tried embracing, the answer keeps waiting patiently inside their own heart. They are beginning to realize that the greatest turning points in life rarely arrive with loud announcements. They arrive quietly, disguised as simple choices that seem ordinary at first, but later become the moments that shape an entire future. Your soulmate can feel they are standing before one of those moments now. They have stopped searching for someone else to tell them what is right. They have stopped hoping that perfect timing will somehow remove every uncertainty. Instead, they are slowly accepting that perfect timing is often nothing more than the moment someone finally becomes brave enough to trust themselves. That realization has lifted a weight they carried for far too long. It has shown them that courage is not the absence of fear. Courage is choosing to move forward even while uncertainty still exists. Every lesson they have learned during this journey has quietly prepared them for this exact chapter. Every disappointment taught resilience. Every period of silence taught patience. Every unanswered question encouraged deeper self-reflection. Looking back now, they can see how every experience shaped the person they have become. There was a time when they believed difficult seasons existed only to test them. Now they understand that those seasons were also preparing them to recognize what truly matters, preparing them to distinguish temporary emotions from lasting truths, preparing them to appreciate meaningful connections with a level of maturity they simply did not possess before. That realization has filled them with gratitude rather than regret, because they no longer wish they could rewrite the past. They simply wish to honor everything the past has taught them. As they continue reflecting on this journey, another truth has become impossible to ignore. They are no longer the same person who first encountered this connection. Life has changed them. Time has changed them. Every challenge has slowly transformed the way they love, the way they trust, and the way they understand themselves. Perhaps that is why fate has chosen this moment instead of an earlier one. Sometimes two people must first become the versions of themselves capable of appreciating what once stood before them unnoticed. Your soulmate is beginning to believe that growth has never been about forgetting the past. It has always been about becoming wise enough to see it differently. That new perspective has given them a peace they have not felt in a very long time. The endless overthinking that once exhausted them is gradually becoming quieter. The constant need for certainty is slowly fading away. In its place is a calm confidence built not upon guarantees, but upon truth. They know they cannot control every outcome. They cannot predict every tomorrow, but they can choose to live honestly today. That decision has become far more important than every fear that once held them back. They are finally understanding that some opportunities deserve to be embraced even without knowing exactly where they will lead. Every meaningful journey begins with one courageous decision, and they can feel themselves standing at the edge of theirs. The future still contains unanswered questions, but those questions no longer frighten them the way they once did. Instead, they inspire curiosity, hope, and quiet anticipation. They have begun imagining a future where they no longer wonder what might have happened, because they chose to listen instead of remaining silent. That vision feels more peaceful than any carefully constructed life built upon avoidance. They understand now that protecting themselves from disappointment also prevented them from experiencing possibilities that could have changed everything. They no longer want fear to write the next chapter of their story. They want honesty to become the author instead. That simple decision has transformed their entire outlook, and perhaps that is the greatest gift fate could ever offer. Not certainty, not perfection, simply the chance to become authentic. As this chapter quietly reaches its conclusion, one final realization continues echoing inside their heart. They believe some connections enter our lives for a reason that extends far beyond a single moment in time. Some people awaken parts of us we never knew existed. Some encounters quietly reshape our future long before we understand their purpose. Your soulmate now believes this connection was never meant to be measured only by distance, circumstances, or the passing of time. It was meant to be measured by the growth it inspired, the lessons it revealed, and the truth it patiently uncovered. Whatever happens next, they know one thing with complete certainty. They will never again ignore what their own heart has been trying to tell them. They have spent too many years waiting for permission to trust themselves, and they no longer need that permission. If fate truly has placed one final opportunity before them, they are beginning to believe it is not simply an opportunity to reconnect with someone important. It's an opportunity to reconnect with the most honest version of themselves. And sometimes, when a person finally chooses truth over fear, the universe quietly begins opening doors that once seemed permanently closed. Perhaps that is why this message found you today. Perhaps this is not simply the end of one chapter, but the quiet beginning of another, where two hearts finally recognize that fate was never asking them to be perfect. It was only asking whether they were ready to stop running from what had always been true.